Smoke choked every breath she took. Flames devoured towering pines, painting a pitch-black sky with violent crimson. Cora held a trembling, whimpering pup tightly against her chest, collapsing onto scorching earth. Vision fading fast, her final prayer was for his survival, completely unaware his father's monstrous roar shattered approaching silence. Blackwood County, Washington, was known for two things: its sprawling, nearly impenetrable evergreen forests, and a logging industry that kept the local economy on life support. Cora Hathaway, a 26-year-old wildlife rehabilitator working out of a severely underfunded clinic on the edge of town, knew the woods better than almost anyone. She spent her days tracking tagged wildlife, treating injured owls, and fighting with Chief Fire Officer Davies about the lack of controlled burns near the eastern ridge. It was mid-August when the catastrophe hit. Authorities would later blame a freak lightning strike, but the locals whispered about arson. The fire did not just spread, it exploded. It moved with an unnatural, hungry speed, turning the drought-stricken pines into Roman candles. Cora was 5 miles deep into the restricted zone when the emergency siren started blaring from the town below. A faint, terrifying wail over the growing roar of the wind. She had been tracking a pregnant lynx whose GPS collar had gone completely still. Within 20 minutes, the sky above her went from a hazy blue to a bruised, suffocating purple, and then to absolute, terrifying black. The temperature spiked drastically. Ash began to fall like dirty snow, coating her khaki uniform and stinging her eyes. She knew the protocol. Abandon the search, find a water source or a clearing, and deploy the foil emergency fire shelter in her pack. But as she turned to sprint toward the rocky outcrop near the dried-up bed of Miller's Creek, a sound stopped her dead in her tracks. It was a cry, high-pitched, desperate, and undeniably terrified. Cora froze, listening over the deafening crackle of burning timber. A seasoned professional, she knew that running toward the sound of a trapped animal in a wildfire was practically a death sentence. Yet, the cry came again. A ragged, coughing yelp that tore right through her chest. It didn't sound like a standard coyote or a feral dog. It sounded eerily human in its despair. Pulling her heat-resistant bandana up over her nose and mouth, Cora veered off the evacuation path and plunged into a thicket of burning ferns. The heat was blistering, singing the fine hairs on her arms and making her eyes water uncontrollably. At the base of a massive, ancient cedar that was entirely engulfed in flames, she found him. A heavy, burning branch had splintered off and crashed to the forest floor, pinning down what looked like a wolf pup. But the creature was strange. It was unusually large for a pup, its fur a striking, pristine silver that caught the hellish glow of the fire. More striking were its eyes. As Cora fell to her knees, batting away flaming debris with her thick leather gloves, the pup looked at her. The eyes were a startling, piercing amber, filled with an intelligence and an awareness that sent a bizarre shiver down her spine, despite the inferno surrounding them. "I've got you," Cora choked out, coughing violently as the smoke seared her lungs. "I've got you, hold on." The branch was massive, the wood superheated and glowing orange from the inside. Cora wedged her boots against the soil, grabbed the underside of the log where it hadn't yet caught fire, and pushed with every ounce of strength her adrenaline-flooded body could muster. Her muscles screamed, and the blistering heat radiated through her gloves, searing the skin of her palms. With a sickening crack, the wood shifted. The silver pup scrambled backward, dragging a clearly broken hind leg. "Come here," Cora gasped, reaching for him. The pup didn't bite or snap, as wild animals usually did in distress. Instead, it dragged itself directly into her arms, burying its little face against her neck, trembling violently. There was no time to assess the injury. A massive pine crashed to the ground 30 yards away, sending a tidal wave of sparks and heat their way. The fire had officially flanked them. The path back to town was gone. The only option was the dry, rocky bed of Miller's Creek, hoping the lack of vegetation would spare them from the worst of the blaze. Cora unzipped her heavy canvas jacket and tucked the pup inside, zipping it up to her collarbone so only his nose peeked out. "We're going to run now," she whispered, her voice a ragged rasp. The next 15 minutes were a blur of pure agony. Cora ran blindly through a landscape that had become a literal hell. Her boots melted against the scorching earth. The air was so hot, it felt like swallowing glass with every breath. Her lungs protested, starved of oxygen, filling instead with toxic carbon monoxide and soot. Fire whipped at her legs, catching the edge of her pants, which she slapped out with agonizing slowness while refusing to drop the heavy weight against her chest. She could feel the pup's erratic heartbeat drumming frantically against her own. It became her metronome. Left foot. Right foot. Keep him alive. Keep him alive. She broke through the burning tree line and collapsed onto the jagged, heat-baked rocks of the creek bed. She was safe from the immediate flames, but the radiant heat was baking the canyon and the smoke was thick, settling heavily into the depression of the riverbed. Cora tried to crawl, to find a crevice, but her body had nothing left. Her vision tunneled. The edges of her consciousness frayed. She fumbled with her backpack, her hands raw, blistered, and shaking so badly she could barely grip the zipper. She managed to pull out the foil fire shelter. It was designed for one person. She unzipped her jacket, pulling the whimpering, coughing silver pup out. The creature looked up at her, letting out a soft, heartbreaking whine, licking her blackened cheek. "You're going to be okay," Cora rasped, blood bubbling at the corner of her cracked lips. She laid the pup on the ground, popped open the foil shelter, and draped it entirely over the animal, sealing the edges down with heavy rocks so no smoke could get in. She curled her own body around the outside of the foil tent, shielding the pup with her own flesh and bone, turning her unprotected back to the blistering, radiant heat of the encroaching firestorm. As the flames roared over the canyon, turning the world to blinding white heat, Cora closed her eyes. Her final thought wasn't of regret, but a silent plea to the universe that the silver pup would make it out. Then, the darkness took her entirely. Silas Montgomery did not run a lumber empire. That was merely the front. Silas was the Alpha King of the Cascadian Pack, a lineage of lichens that had controlled the entire Pacific Northwest Territory for 3 centuries. He was a man of terrifying power, immense wealth, and right now, unparalleled, mind-shattering panic. "Alpha!" Dominic Reed, his beta, shouted over the roar of the helicopter blades as they touched down in a cleared logging zone 3 miles from the inferno. The fire lines are holding at the southern ridge, but Sector 4 is completely gone. The heat signatures are massive. Silas didn't wait for the skids to fully settle. He leapt from the chopper, the heavy wash of the blades whipping his dark coat around his imposing frame. His eyes, usually a calm, calculating slate grey, were bleeding into a ferocious, glowing gold. Where was he last seen? Silas's voice wasn't a question. It was a command that rattled the chests of the pack warriors standing by. "Near the eastern ridge, sir," Dominic replied, jogging to keep up with his alpha's long strides. "Leo was playing with the tracker pups. They strayed too far. When the rogue pack ignited the perimeter to cover their border crossing, the wind shifted. The pups scattered. We recovered 3, but Leo, his scent trail went straight toward Logger's Peak." Silas felt his chest tighten so violently, it felt like a physical blow. His son. His 4-year-old heir. Leo hadn't yet mastered his human shift under extreme stress. If he was terrified, he would be trapped in his pup form, vulnerable and small. "Set up a perimeter," Silas snarled to the gathered-in forces. "Shoot any rogue on sight. Dominic, you're with me." Silas didn't bother navigating the human roads. He stripped his coat, letting the volatile, explosive power of his wolf take over. In a flurry of cracking bones and expanding muscle, a monstrous, pitch-black timber wolf stood in his place, standing nearly 6 feet at the shoulder. He threw his massive head back and let out a roar that echoed over the crackling fire. A sound of absolute dominance and profound heartbreak. He charged into the smoke. The heat didn't bother him the way it did humans, but the ash destroyed the scent trails. Silas ran on pure instinct, his massive paws tearing up the scorched earth, leaping over burning logs. He navigated by memory, heading straight for the epicenter of the fire near Miller's Creek. "Please," the Alpha prayed to the moon goddess, a deity he hadn't spoken to since his mate died in childbirth 4 years ago. "Take me. Take my crown. Just spare my boy." As he neared the rocky canyon of the dried creek bed, a scent finally cut through the overwhelming stench of burning pine and ozone. It was incredibly faint, masked heavily by smoke and charred flesh, blood, human blood, and beneath it, the distinctive, sweet milk scent of a wolf pup. Silas shifted back to his human form mid-stride, hitting the rocky ground barefoot and fully clothed in just his torn trousers. He scrambled down the steep, jagged embankment, ignoring the burning rocks slicing into his soles. At the center of the creek bed lay a small, makeshift mound. A human body was curled protectively around a crumpled foil emergency blanket. Silas's heart flatlined. The human was unmoving, their back severely burned, uniform melted into their skin. Silas shoved the human's limp body aside with frantic, terrifying strength. He ripped the foil blanket away. Underneath, shaking violently, coated in soot but miraculously unburned, was a tiny silver wolf. "Leo!" Silas gasped, dropping to his knees. The pup let out a weak cry and immediately began to shift. Fur receded, bones cracked softly, and within seconds, a small, soot-covered 4-year-old boy was sobbing, throwing his little arms around his father's neck. "Papa! Papa!" Leo wailed, burying his face in Silas's chest. "The fire! The lady! She saved me!" Silas crushed his son to his chest, burying his face in the boy's dark hair, inhaling the scent of him to prove he was real. Tears, foreign and hot, tracked through the ash on the Alpha King's face. He held his son for a long, fractured moment, the relief so immense it made him dizzy. "I have you, little wolf," Silas murmured fiercely. "You're safe." Only then did Silas turn his attention to the human who had saved his world. He gently set Leo aside and crawled over to the unmoving form. It was a woman. Her face was blackened with soot, her lips cracked and bleeding, her breathing non-existent. The level of smoke she had inhaled combined with the thermal burns. A human body couldn't survive it. Silas reached out, placing 2 fingers against the ruined skin of her throat to check for a pulse. The moment his skin touched hers, a violent, electric shock ripped up Silas's arm and slammed straight into his heart. He jerked his hand back as if he had been burned. His golden wolf eyes widened in absolute shock, his pupils dilating until his eyes were entirely black. It was impossible. The ash and smoke had masked it. The smell of her own burning flesh had hidden it. But touching her, feeling the faint, microscopic thrum of her fading life force beneath his fingers, unlocked the scent perfectly. Vanilla. Rain on hot asphalt, wild blackberries. Mate. His wolf clawed frantically at the inside of his mind, howling a sound of joyous discovery, instantly followed by agonizing, crushing despair. "Mate, Diane! Save her!" Silas had believed his mate was gone, lost to a tragedy years ago, but the moon goddess in her infinite, cruel wisdom had granted him a second chance, a true, fated mate. and he was finding her at the exact moment she was dying, having sacrificed her own life to save his son. "No," Silas whispered, his voice cracking. "No. You don't get to do this. You don't get to save my son and leave me. I forbid it." He pressed his ear to her chest. Her heart was beating, but it was a stuttering, agonizingly slow rhythm. One beat every 5 seconds. She was actively crossing over. "Dominic!" Silas roared, a sound that shook the very bedrock of the canyon. "Get the medevac down here now!" There was no time for a hospital. No human doctor like Dr. Harrison Caldwell at the local clinic could fix the damage to her lungs and skin. There was only one way to pull a human back from the absolute brink of death, and it was a forbidden, highly volatile pack law. Silas didn't hesitate. He brought his own wrist to his mouth and bit down savagely, tearing through his own flesh and vein with his elongated canines. Alpha blood was a potent, dangerous thing. It carried the regenerative power of the lichen lineage. In humans, it could either heal them miraculously or trigger a fatal, agonizing rejection. He forced her jaw open gently. "Drink," he commanded softly, positioning his bleeding wrist over her cracked lips. "Please, little bird. Drink." Thick, dark blood dripped into her mouth. For a terrifying 10 seconds, nothing happened. She was too far gone to swallow. Silas felt his own chest tightening in a panic he hadn't felt in centuries. He stroked her throat, using his own thumb to massage the swallowing reflex, forcing the potent blood down her ruined esophagus. Suddenly, the woman's body arched off the ground in a violent, rigid spasm. Her eyes flew open, not brown or blue, but momentarily flashing a brilliant, terrifying gold as the alpha blood violently warred with her dying human cells. She let out a horrific, blood-curdling scream that tore through the canyon, her hands clawing desperately at the rocky earth before she went entirely, terrifyingly limp. The canyon fell silent, save for the crackle of the distant fire and the quiet sobbing of the little boy watching from the rocks. Silas stared at her motionless body, his bloody wrist still suspended in the air. He couldn't hear a heartbeat. For 3 days, Cora Hathaway floated in a sensory void, tethered to the waking world only by the rhythmic, agonizing burn in her veins. When her consciousness finally pierced through the darkness, she did not wake to the sterile, harsh, fluorescent lights of the Blackwood County General Hospital. Instead, she opened her eyes to a sprawling, high-vaulted ceiling constructed of exposed cedar beams, bathed in the soft, ambient glow of overcast daylight filtering through floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass. She took a breath. It was a sharp, reflexive gasp, anticipating the shredding agony of smoke-ruined lungs. But there was no pain. Her chest expanded fully, drawing in air that smelled inexplicably of rain-washed pine and rich, dark earth. "Don't try to sit up yet," a deep, gravelly voice commanded from the corner of the room. Cora turned her head. Sitting in a leather wingback chair was a man who looked like he had been carved from the very granite of the Cascade Mountains. He wore a tailored charcoal suit with no tie, exuding an aura of wealth, authority, and something intensely dangerous. His slate-grey eyes were locked onto hers with a mixture of predatory focus and profound relief. "Where am I?" Cora rasped. Her voice was slightly hoarse, but fundamentally intact. She looked down at her arms. The severe second-degree burns she remembered sustaining from the falling timber were completely gone. In their place were faint, shimmering silver lines tracing over her skin like delicate metallic spider webs. "What happened to my hands?" "The fire." "You are at the Montgomery estate," Silas said, slowly standing up. He approached her bed with measured, deliberately quiet steps, as if trying not to spook a wild animal. "My name is Silas Montgomery, and you saved my son, Leo." Cora's brow furrowed. The memories crashed over her like a collapsing dam. The smoke, the heat, the foil blanket, the terrified silver pup. Your son? But it was a wolf. A silver pup. I covered him. The door to the suite hissed open, and a distinguished older man in a white medical coat stepped in, carrying a tablet. Alpha, the man acknowledged Silas with a deep nod before turning to Cora. Miss Hathaway. I am Dr. Arthur Penhaligon. It is nothing short of a medical anomaly that you are awake, let alone conversing. Dr. Penhaligon, Silas interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Give us a moment. The doctor bowed his head and retreated instantly. Silas pulled a chair to the side of her bed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, clasping his hands together. Cora, what I am about to tell you will sound like a trauma-induced hallucination. But I need you to look at me, listen to your own heightened senses, and know that I am speaking the absolute truth. For the next hour, Silas stripped away the illusion of the world Cora thought she knew. He explained the lycanthropes, the territorial pacts that governed the vast, untamed wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, and the ancient bloodlines that kept them hidden from human society. He explained that Leo, trapped in panic by the flames, had been stuck in his pup form. I was dying, Cora stated, tracing the silver web on her forearm. Her scientific mind, trained in biology and anatomy, rebelled against the narrative, yet the irrefutable evidence was written on her own flesh. No human survives inhaling that much superheated carbon. My back was exposed to radiant heat, exceeding 600 degrees. You did die, Cora, Silas said softly. The raw vulnerability in his voice made her heart stutter. Your heart stopped in the canyon. Human medicine could not save you. The only way to pull you back was to introduce a regenerative catalyst. He unbuttoned his left cuff, rolling up the sleeve to reveal a jagged, freshly healed scar over his radial artery. Alpha blood. Cora stared at his wrist, a phantom taste of dark, coppery heat suddenly coating the back of her tongue. She shuddered, a strange, electric warmth pooling in her lower abdomen as she looked back into his eyes. You gave me your blood. It was a monumental risk, Silas confessed, his gaze dropping to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. In 99% of cases, a human body aggressively rejects lichen blood. The resulting cellular degradation is instantaneous and fatal. But you didn't reject it. Your body assimilated it. It rebuilt your lungs, your skin, your muscle tissue. Why? Cora whispered, feeling a strange, magnetic pull toward this terrifying stranger. Why risk it on a stranger? Silas reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The contact sent a jolt of pure electricity straight down her spine. Because, Cora, the moment I touched you in that canyon, my wolf recognized what my human mind couldn't comprehend. You are not a stranger. You are my fated mate. Before Cora could process the magnitude of that statement, the heavy oak door flew open. Dominic Reed, Silas's beta, strode in, his face tight with grim urgency. Silas, we have a massive problem, Dominic stated, ignoring the usual protocols. Detective Thomas Granger just forwarded the preliminary arson report from the state investigators. The fire wasn't a rogue pack crossing the border. It was a localized ignition using military-grade white phosphorus. Silas stood up instantly, the gentle demeanor vanishing, replaced by cold, calculated fury. Who? Gregory Hayes. Dominic spat the name. Blackwood Timber Holdings. Granger found a paper trail. Hayes hired a paramilitary contractor, human mercenaries, heavily armed with silver ordnance. They knew the pack was distracted by the border disputes. The fire was a smokescreen. The real objective was to assassinate Leo to sever your bloodline and force the pack to forfeit the land rights to the Eastern Ridge. Hayes wants the lithium deposits under the ridge, Silas growled, his eyes flashing a dangerous, luminescent gold. Worse, Dominic continued, glancing nervously at Cora. The mercenaries had drones mapping the fire perimeter. They have thermal footage of Cora pulling Leo from the wreckage. They know she survived. And Hayes knows she can testify that the fire was a targeted hit. They are moving on the estate tonight. The Montgomery estate, usually a sanctuary of quiet wealth, transformed into a fortress within an hour. Heavily armed pack enforcers patrolled the perimeter, and the heavy steel shutters slammed down over the floor-to-ceiling windows. Cora refused to stay in the medical bay. The alpha blood coursing through her veins had done more than just knit her flesh back together. It had rewired her nervous system. She felt a thrumming, hyper-aware energy vibrating in her muscles. Her hearing was sharp enough to pick up the hushed, tactical conversations of the guards 3 floors below. She found Leo in the estate's fortified library. The 4-year-old was clutching a stuffed bear, his wide amber eyes terrified. When he saw Cora, he dropped the bear and ran to her, burying his face in her stomach. "You're awake," the little boy sniffled, holding on to her tightly. Cora knelt, wrapping her arms around him, a fierce, primal surge of protectiveness washing over her. "I'm right here, buddy. I promised I've got you. Didn't I?" Outside, the first explosion shattered the night. The heavy oak doors of the library rattled. Hayes's mercenaries had bypassed the outer perimeter, using acoustic dampeners and heavy explosives to breach the southern wall. The estate's alarms shrieked, a deafening wail that made Cora wince as her newly heightened hearing peaked. "Stay behind me," Cora commanded Leo, her voice dropping an octave, taking on a strange, commanding resonance she didn't recognize. The library doors burst open, splintering off their hinges. 2 men clad in black tactical gear stepped into the room, assault rifles raised. Their eyes scanned the room, locking on to Cora and the boy. "Target acquired," the lead mercenary spoke into his comms unit, eliminating the witness and the pup. He raised his weapon. Cora didn't think. She reacted. The alpha blood in her system ignited. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl. She shoved Leo under the massive mahogany desk, grabbed a heavy, solid bronze globe from a side table, and hurled it with terrifying, unnatural force. The bronze sphere struck the lead mercenary square in the chest, the impact sounding like a car crash. The man was thrown backward, crashing through the splintered doors and into the hallway, his ribs visibly caved in. The second mercenary stared in shock, his rifle wavering for a fraction of a second. It was all the time Silas needed. A monstrous blur of black fur and lethal muscle dropped from the shadowed balcony above the hallway. Silas, fully shifted into his alpha wolf form, landed on the second mercenary. There was a sickening crunch, a muffled scream, and then absolute silence. Silas shifted back to his human form seamlessly, standing naked and covered in the mercenary's blood in the ruined doorway. His chest heaved, his golden eyes blazing with a protective fury that terrified and thrilled Cora in equal measure. He stepped over the bodies, crossing the room to where Cora stood shielding the desk. "Are you hurt?" Silas demanded, grasping her shoulders, his gaze scanning her frantically. "No," Cora breathed, her own heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at her hands, stunned by the physical power she had just exerted. I threw that." Silas looked at the dented bronze globe, then back to her. A slow, deeply possessive smile spread across his face. "The blood of a king doesn't create a fragile human, little bird. It creates a queen." The rest of the night was a brutal mop-up operation. With their element of surprise ruined and the Alpha King fully unleashed, Hayes's mercenaries were systematically hunted down and eliminated by the pack enforcers. By dawn, Detective Granger had enough evidence from the captured comms and the surviving contractors to arrest Gregory Hayes on federal domestic terrorism charges. The Blackwood Timber Holdings empire was effectively dismantled before the sun breached the horizon. Later that evening, as the smoke from the distant, dying forest fires finally began to clear, Cora stood on the private balcony of Silas's master suite. The cool mountain air felt pristine against her newly healed skin. Silas stepped up behind her, wrapping his large, warm arms around her waist, pulling her back flush against his chest. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling her scent deeply, a low, contented rumble vibrating in his chest. "You belong here," Silas murmured, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "With us. With the pack." Cora leaned back into him, watching the sun set over the sprawling, ancient forest she had spent her life protecting. She had lost her quiet human life in the flames, but from the ashes, she had been forged into something immensely stronger. She placed her hand over Silas's, where it rested on her stomach, intertwining her fingers with the Alpha King. "I know," Cora whispered, finally accepting the absolute truth of the bond humming in her blood. "I'm not going anywhere." The scars on Cora's back faded into silvery webs, a permanent testament to the fire that forged a queen. Gregory Hayes and his mercenaries were buried beneath the very earth they sought to steal. Standing on the estate balcony, Silas wrapped his arms around his fated mate, their son sleeping peacefully inside. The woods were quiet again, guarded by a fiercely devoted human who became the mother of wolves.